different music that so you can match a psalm with a different tune. And for many years, Presbyterians only used the Psalter. We didn't use the hymn book, so that our Presbyterian tradition is very, very much into the Psalms. But the reality is, and I've given a lecture, not taught an extended course, on Lewis and the Psalms about 5 times. And every time I ask the crowd, how many people have read through all 150 Psalms? And that's when heads go down and hands don't go up. And Lewis was very concerned. What is it that keeps Christians from reading the Psalms? Much earlier in his life, he wrote a book about Paradise Lost called The Preface to Paradise Lost. And its only goal was to get people to read Paradise Lost. It had fallen out of fashion. Well, he wrote Reflections on the Psalms for the same purpose. He had a friend who wanted Lewis to write a book on the Psalms. Lewis was at the happiest point of his life. His wife, Joy, had gone through a bout of cancer, but she was in remission. And so he was full of energy to do something. And he wrote what he called this unimportant little book. But that unimportant little book was to help Christians open the book of Psalms. So that's what my goal for this class is, that we read 150 Psalms in a month. The only real purpose of this class is to get us to read the Psalms, so that the next time someone says, how many of you have read all 150 Psalms? You raise your hand and say, yes. But before we do that, I don't know you as well as I would like to. So if you have a piece of paper or a very good memory, I have 4 questions I want to ask and want each one of us to answer. First question, if you take the piece of paper, fold it in half in kind of a quadrant, in the upper left-hand side, write your name, and if you knew why you were named, the name you are named. If you know the meaning, or know I was named after an uncle or a grandfather or a grandmother. So first question is easy. What's your name and why were you named that name? In the upper right quadrant, my question is, who first told you about God? And again, it's whatever pops into your mind. The lower left quadrant is, who has been a significant mentor to you in your life? Could be in adolescence, it could be at work. Who has had a real impact on your life? What name pops to mind? What person?
Here, you get a piece of paper here.
And then my last question in the lower right quadrant is, what is your favorite psalm?
Here.
So your name, who first told you about God, name a mentor in your life, and if you have a favorite psalm, what would that be? Sorry to give you homework in an adult education class. That's not very fair, but thank you.
Name and who was your name given?
Who would be brave enough to go first?
The right hand is who introduced you
To God.
I'll go ahead.
Okay.
So my name's Andy Leonard, and I have no idea if that has any special significance. My middle name's the same as my dad's middle name, so that's the only connection I know of.
Significant mentor.
I would say my parents are the first ones who taught me about God. A mentor would be my major professor in graduate school, Jim Hill. And for a favorite psalm, I have to pick Psalm 23, mostly because that's the one I know the best.
Okay.
Okay, I was named Bob because my mom and dad wanted a simple name for their kids. I'm Bob and my brother was Jim. That was it. Like Andy, my middle name Wallace, I've got a lot of Scottish heritage, but Wallace was the same as my dad's middle name. So there's a little bit of that. Like Andy, it was my parents, I'm sure, told me first about God. A mentor to me was a gentleman who died when I was in high school, but he was my dad's best fishing friend. And he was a member of our church, and he just was a wise, kind guy. He was an incredible fisherman, but just a kind man who just had things to say and to listen to. And Roger Dahl was his name, wonderful man. And my favorite psalm, I'm pretty
Favorite psalm.
100.
Right.
Psalm 100?
Psalm 100.
Well, you're a good Presbyterian.
Did you want to do this, Kathy?
No, I'll just listen.
Okay.
I just kind of got here.
That's fine. Karen?
My mother said she went to a movie when she was about to have me and came home and there must have been Karen in there. So that's how she came upon the name. And let's see what else. Oh, and who told you of God? I guess I would say my Sunday school teachers, because I always went to Sunday school.
Okay.
I mean, from young, so that grew up telling me of God. In Psalm, is it 100 that I was trying to find? Yeah, make a joyful shout. Yes, that's the one I was going to say. Psalm 100.
Okay. Whoa, it's, so far, Psalm 100 is leading Psalm 23. This rarely happens. I'm excited.
And the mentor in your life, I haven't really gotten that far. Let me see. I guess my counselors, when I was, because I went to camp all of my life, established camp every summer.
Okay.
From about 3rd grade through counselor, through nurse of the camp. But my counselors.
Okay. Fantastic. Dave, do you want to?
Yeah, my name is significant because my mother decided that all the letters should be above the line. So it's David William Geddes, because for some reason she didn't want me below the line. So that was that. I grew up in the GARB Baptist quadrant, and so I knew about God before I even got to church. Significant mentor was probably one of my professors at Taylor. We just spent a lot of time together. Favorite psalm is 100.
Oh my goodness, this is getting to be a runaway lead. I don't think Psalm 23 is going to be able to catch up.
Greg, I'll say that 123 is my favorite.
Okay.
23rd Psalm.
Okay. So we got 2 to 3. Okay. Fred, did you get the questions?
I did. I saw that Andy had put them up in the chat room, which was
He's
great.
amazing. isn't he?
I apologize for being late. I fell asleep after dinner
You need that.
on the couch. So.
Aren't naps wonderful, Fred?
That was great. It was. I had to have dessert right now, though.
Who told you about God?
Who told me about God? My mother told me. We didn't belong to a church. We never went to church, but my mother would always say we're all God's children,
Hmm.
and that truly, I came to know that later in my life, you know.
Mhm.
But my parents lived pretty much by the golden rule, and you know, so that's kind of where I learned about God, was from her.
How about a mentor?
Who was my mentor?
Yeah, who has really influenced your life?
Oh my gosh, there's so many people. That I went to DePaul University. There were several professors who were, I think, pretty influential. There were some guys that I worked for who were influential. It's a good question. Have to really, you know, it was curious too, is that a number of men in the neighborhood were influential in many ways. And most of them were in World War II. You know, and Greg, I went to Vietnam after graduate school, and you know, kind of one of the reasons why I felt like I had to serve, it wasn't by choice, I was drafted. One of the reasons that I kind of did that was because of maybe out of respect for many of the men who I had seen growing up.
Oh.
Not like I was in favor of it or anything else, but I felt
It was from Saturday morning.
I felt like I had to at least live up to my responsibility, you know.
Fantastic. How about a favorite psalm?
5 of us.
You know, I'm not going to break the tie because I don't think I really have a favorite psalm.
Okay.
Seems like every time I read one, I get more influenced, you know. So
What's up to John and Monica then? This is where it gets tense.
Well, I'll go first. Find my notes. My given name is Jonathan. So I think my mother picked it out of the Bible. Supposedly, a nurse said after she named me, the nurse said, "Well, that's a girl's name." And my mother said, "You haven't read your Bible." I think my mother probably was the mentor who introduced me to God. From about a month after I was born until I think 1946, my dad was in Europe. And I think he came home in late 45 or 46. My mentor is a guy that just passed away. His name Marv Goldsmith. I learned a lot of Yiddish from him, but I got my work ethic and my power of thinking, I think, my dedication to him. There were days that I liked to kill him, but overall, he was a great guy and I really miss him. And I'm gonna hit the 23rd.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. I guess I'm the last one. My name is Monica, and I was given the name because my grandmother liked it and had named a child, an infant that, who didn't make it. And so my parents decided to name me Monica. Let's see. I guess the most influential as a child and what have you is my grandmother, a former, how do we put it? Salvation Army person. And in fact, her brother and his wife are still Salvation Army majors, the last I heard. My other grandmother also had a lot of influence, and I spent a lot of time with them. That was back in the days when you grew up close to grandparents. It doesn't happen anymore, unfortunately. I guess I have two mentors. One was the minister of my youth, Reverend Reeves. And he always thought, I think, that I was going to go into the ministry. And I came close. But I decided I wanted to have a family, and I didn't see that I could put enough energy into both. Both were full-time jobs. I also had a teacher in junior high, high school, and even when I was teaching, she was a counselor in the same district. So she was a mentor.
And your favorite song?
My favorite song, we're busting the thing, 23rd.
Oh, the last minute.
I have one thing more, couple things to add because I forgot, here just
Okay.
that my given name is Frederick Kyle Rosen. My grandfather was an immigrant from Germany, was Ferdinand.
Oh.
They used to call him Fred, so fortunately they named me Frederick, not Ferdinand. And my mother's maiden name was Kyle. And as I think of the many mentors, I had older cousins who were like 20, 25, 30 years older than I was. And many of the cousins and many of the aunts and uncles were always kind of looking out for us. And they were good examples for us. Maybe that's what I want to say. So family was very important. I never knew any of my grandparents other than my grandfather, Ferdinand. And he died when I was like 5 years old. But I have fond memories of him. I joke about this, that he taught me how to drive his 47 Oldsmobile because I was 4 years old and I would sit on his lap. And this is 1951, I guess, 1950.
Love it.
We would drive from the west side of Chicago out to Lombard, where he had property where he had a garden. He was an avid gardener. And I'd sit on Ferdinand's lap and drive the car.
Oh my God.
Fred, was that a stick shift or was that first hydromatic?
It was a stick shift, pal.
Okay.
Occasionally he'd let me shift it.
I've
reach the clutch.
been asking variations of those questions ever since I was a youth pastor. And I've been sort of keeping a list, but I loved your answers. And thank goodness college and graduate student professors got some credit. Usually it's a high school teacher or a coach or things like that for a mentor. So I'll tell some of my friends over at the college that they too can live a life of significance. I want to do it not for myself, but for C.S. Lewis. He was Clive Staples Lewis. Relatives were Clive and Staples. He absolutely hated and detested that name. So nobody ever called him Clive. He was Jack or C.S. Lewis. His mother was the person who really told him about God, even though his grandfather was a Presbyterian minister, an Anglican minister, excuse me. Unfortunately, when he was about 10 years old, his mother died and he prayed for God to save his mother. And when she died, he basically went into a state of real doubt. The big mentor in his life was someone down in Bookham, Surrey, by the name of Kirkpatrick, who was a defrocked Presbyterian pastor who became a schoolmaster. And he was an atheist, and Lewis really learned all sorts of things to prepare him for Oxford, and also learned atheism from his mentor, which is kind of ironic. So Lewis did not come back to faith until he was almost 30. And he has a whole bunch of favorite Psalms because Lewis did what I'm encouraging us to dare each other to do and to hold each other accountable to do, and that's to read all 150 Psalms in a month. Every month he read the book of Psalms from beginning to end. And he read 5 Psalms a day.
5 a day, yeah.
So it's really not a daunting task. And so he had this incredible love of the Psalms, and he found himself then, and it would be even worse now, with people who were quite unfamiliar with the Psalms. So he wrote this book, and I don't want to talk about this book so much. Andy, I have a chapter that I wrote for a book about the reflections on the Psalms that I'd like to get to everyone. Is the easiest way to give out my email address, or how if I can get your email addresses, I can email you a copy of that. Or since I think we're all at First Presbyterian, we can actually just make some copies.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think I have emails for everybody that's with us tonight.
Okay.
So
If
if
you
you want to
send them
email
to
it to me, I can email it out to this
Okay.
group.
Great, that would be great. But one of the things that I like about Lewis is the fact that he didn't say, look at me. It was look with me. And he's got this wonderful essay about the meditations in a tool yard. And he's looking at a beam of light going up, and his eyes follow the beam of light through the darkness into the light. And so that's what he's trying to do in this reflection in the Psalms. He said, hey, I'm not trying to show you how smart I am or how good a biblical interpreter I am. I just want you all to read the Psalms. And so I'm going to just take a few minutes, and stop me at any time, please. In his introduction, he talks about parallelism in the Psalms. Now, I didn't ask for your favorite poet, but someone in our generation like poems that rhyme. Some people don't. You know, there's rhyme, there's meter, but in Hebrew poetry, the big thing is parallelism. And as you read the Psalms, you're going to read and say, well, the psalmist just repeated that again in slightly different words. That's the beauty of the Psalms. So very often a statement is made and then it is restated in slightly different words, and that's what's called parallelism. And the beauty of parallelism, it translates to any language. It isn't based on rhyme or meter. Now, I won't ask any of you if you ever had heard that before, but every time that I give this, somebody says, oh my goodness, I had no idea. But as you read your 5 Psalms a day, see how often the psalmist first says something and then repeats it. But here is my favorite thing, and hopefully I can find the right page. Lewis complains about the commentaries that are written on the Psalms. Does everyone know what a commentary is?
Yeah.
You know, if we want to have commentary to understand Lewis' problem with commentaries, he said, first of all, they don't address the questions I really have. And they give me a whole way too much information I really don't need. And when it comes to the Psalms, he says the major problem, people don't read the Psalms, is they're very uncomfortable with the Old Testament. As an early Presbyterian pastor, I had a young woman come up to me after I preached, and she said, Pastor, I would prefer that you only preach from the New Testament. I want to hear about the nice side of God, not the bad side of God. And I'm about to play a recording of what may be one of my favorite Psalms, except for the very last verse. But before we get to that, what Lewis says is, let me just read it. Why try to paraphrase him? I begin with those characteristics of the Psalms which are the most repellent. Other people of my age will know why. Our generation was brought up to eat everything on the plate.
Your mic, John.
And it was a sound principle of nursery gastronomy to polish off the nasty things first and leave the tidbits to the end. And what Lewis says is there are some nasty bits in the Psalms. And let's deal with those right up front, because that's what's keeping people from reading the Psalms. Does everyone remember the musical Godspell?
Yes.
I think it showed up on Broadway in 1973. And there's a very haunting song called On the Willows. And Andy, I may mess up things if I turn on my iPhone, but I'll try it. Can you?
Here.
Just a few more.
I can hear the melody, but I just can't pick up the words.
Okay. Well, turn to Psalm 137. It's right out of the Psalm book. So I'm the chaplain of the graduate school at Wheaton, and we had a visiting speaker just a few weeks ago who was going to preach on Psalm 137. And it's a lament psalm, and people are going through COVID and they're isolated and they feel bad. And he thought it would just be a wonderful psalm to speak on. And by the way, the Psalms have become much more popular since COVID for a number of reasons. Well, I have a wonderful student assistant who was supposed to read Psalm 137. And she came to me and said, I will not and cannot read Psalm 137. And I said, well, why not? And she said, because of the last verse. So there's this beautiful lament. It's been made into a song. And then we get to verse 8 and 9. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is he who repays you for what you have done to us. He who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. So here are the Jewish people in exile in Babylon in this lament, and they say, we think it would be good to bash Babylonian babies. And my young colleague said, I just cannot read that psalm. And there's a lot of that in the Psalms. In fact, it's called the Imprecatory Psalms, or the cursing Psalms. And Lewis says it's little verses like that that make the Psalms foreign to us. Any response to that? He's got a pretty nifty one, but it's not till later in the book, so I don't want to give it away. But as you read your Psalms, I would encourage you to kind of take a note and say, ooh, that's a little painful. I'm not sure I would say that. The flip side is I have a good friend who's going through an incredibly painful divorce. And he's reading these cursing Psalms and he's going, wow, this is great. This is my ex-wife. That's not the best way to read them either. But there is a honesty to the Psalms that's missing in a lot of our lives. So Lewis concludes his introduction to the book saying this is not a book of apologetics. He's not trying to defend the faith. He says, but you can defend the faith, but sometimes you just have to feed from it. So he sees the Psalms as a devotional book. So he sees a barrier between them and the Christian, but he also sees it as a tremendously nourishing thing to do, is to read the Psalms. So that's his introduction. And then he goes into what I think is very interesting, and I'm fascinated to know what you're going to think about this. Have you heard the word justice in our culture over the last year or so?
Once or twice.
Can anybody define it for me? It's hard because I have students and I ask them, can you define love? And they go on and on and on. And I say, can you define justice? And we can't get a consensus.
I don't know, what is equitable, what is fair,
Mm-hmm.
what is honest, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. What is due to a person? Those are great answers. John Rawls was a Harvard political philosopher who died a few years ago, and his famous phrase is "justice is fairness."
Yeah.
You know, so I mean that's kind of a working definition, but justice is very hard then and now. And Lewis, after he says, "Okay, we're going to deal with the hard bits," we're going to deal with the issues that we may have moral or ethical reservations about the way the ancient Jewish psalmists thought. So just we don't have much time tonight, but I wanted to talk about some ethical concerns that modern Christians would have about ancient Jewish thinking. Now, Lewis has a great term called chronological snobbery. And every generation thinks they are much smarter and much moral than the generation before. And maybe the youngest generation has said, well, my parents' generation might have been good on better than ours in personal morality. They're certainly not as good as we are in social morality. You know, every generation kind of looks at the predecessors and says, they don't really understand it. We understand it better. And Lewis says you can't understand the Psalms unless you understand how important the idea of justice was to the Jewish person. Now, some of the Psalms were written by King David, and they were written at the heyday when Israel was a major and mighty place. But the majority of the Psalms were written when Israel was and Judah were falling apart, and when the nation went into exile. So that's why there's some very sad Psalms as well. And even Psalm 137, some horrific things happened when Babylon took over, and they wanted justice and they wanted God's judgment. But here's what I find so interesting. Let me just read from Lewis. The ancient Jews, like ourselves, think of God's judgment in terms of an earthly court of justice. The difference is the Christian pictures the case to be tried as a criminal case with himself at the dock. So Christians look at justice as a criminal case. We've all sinned. We all fall short. We have to have Jesus and his mercy and grace. But Lewis goes on. The Jew pictures it as a civil case with himself as the plaintiff. The one hopes for acquittal, or rather pardon, so that's the Christian. The other hopes for resounding triumph with heavy damages. And I find that absolutely fascinating as I read the Psalms. There's a sense that injustice has been done. God, look at me. I'm blameless. I'm right. The other person is wrong. My enemies are prevailing against me. And it's very easy for us to say, well, as Christians, we have a superior view of things. But I love what Lewis says. The Christian sees himself as the defendant in a criminal case. The psalmist sees himself as the plaintiff in a civil case. What do you think of that concept? Because it's critical to understanding the Psalms, according to Lewis.
One of the things that comes to my mind is maybe Jewish perception of what justice was prior to Christ. I mean, in Jewish law, wasn't justice more focused on vengeance in kind or appropriate vengeance, appropriate retribution? Or
Well, there's books in the Old Testament, yes, that tell what the appropriate punishment is for a particular crime.
I mean, it just seemed like things were so focused on that in Jewish law. I don't know if that answers your question.
He's talking about civil law. So the idea of somebody, yeah, so it's interesting. I was laughing because Lewis obviously had never been to Chicago, because he's talking about how good justice is. And he says, our judges don't receive bribes and that sort of thing. But he goes on to say how the ancient judges were quite corrupt. And in light of just all the social justice things that we're hearing, it was very hard for an ancient person, unless they had power and prosperity and connections, to even get to see a judge. And Lewis points out that's why the unjust judge in the parable that Jesus tells is not a judge who takes bribe, but he just won't pay attention to the little person. And the Jewish psalmist felt like he or she was the little person and was not getting justice and was aching for justice. In fact, Lewis says, no, I know very few Christians have read the book of Judges. I know that from personal experience. But the judges are really, Lewis says a better translation was champion. You remember, Deborah and the judges, they destroyed the Philistines. They were champions. In fact, Lewis says there it's more like Jack and the Beanstalk slaying the giant than a wigged judge in a British court. But then Lewis very gently says there is a problem, because the psalmist is almost always the indignant plaintiff. And this leads to what he calls the prison of self-righteousness. And he closes the chapter and he says, as we read the Psalms, we have to realize this idea of righteousness, that we can be right without being righteous. In a civil case, I may not be a very good person, but in a particular situation, I may be in the right. But that doesn't make me righteous. But he said the psalmists do tend to be very self-righteous prigs. Now, when you read the Psalms, see if he's right or he's wrong. But there are a whole number of Psalms that are called the cursing or imprecatory Psalms. And that keeps some people from reading. It keeps other people, like my friend going through a divorce, going, hey, I feel really good reading these. But what my friend says, to be fair to him, he said, I have a lot of anger and hurt stored up inside of me. And as I read the Psalms, I start to cry. And I realize here's somebody who's in a relationship with God, that they can actually voice what they're really thinking. So Lewis says, yes, don't be afraid of the Psalms just because of the cursing Psalms, or of the self-righteousness. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. My absolute favorite chapter in the book is called the cursing Psalms. And this is the imprecatory Psalms. And Psalm 137 is an example. We talked about, it's a beautiful, haunting song, a lament. And then it says, bash those Babylonian babies. But guess, and I don't want to offend the majority of you, we all love the 23rd Psalm. But let me read what Lewis says. Worst of all, now this isn't good for a cursing psalm. Worst of all, The Lord is my shepherd, Psalm 23. After the green pasture, the waters of comfort, the sure confidence in the valley of the shadow, we suddenly run across verse 5. Thou shalt prepare a table for me against them that trouble me, or in the presence of my enemies is probably what we're more used to. Or as Dr. Moffat translated, thou art my host, spreading a feast for me while my enemies have to look on. The poet's enjoyment of his present prosperity would not be complete unless those horrid Joneses who used to look down their noses on him were watching it and hating it. This may not be as diabolical as passages I have quoted above, but the pettiness and the vulgarity of it, especially in such surroundings, are hard to endure. So I see that's why Lewis can be fun. Who would dare attack the 23rd Psalm?
Yeah.
But from a civil justice point of view, we like that idea of somebody who used to look down at us suddenly having to watch. Suddenly we have prosperity or success. You think Lewis is being fair to the 23rd Psalm?
No.
Those of us who chose Psalm 100 are, well, yeah, it's fun.
I think it's so amazing how the complexities of life are so woven into so many of these passages,
Mm-hmm.
and how it's just a matter of perception. And at times, and the perception can be different at times, which is just amazing.
Let me read you the offending paragraph from the Message.
Okay. Oh, great.
You serve me a 6-course dinner right in front of my enemies. You revive my drooping head, my cup brims with blessing.
Finish it, John. What is it?
Your beauty and love chase after me every day of my life. I'm back home in the house of God for the rest of my life.
That's a wonderful translation. But again, Lewis is saying, should we really relish the facts when our enemies are put down? Since we're to love our enemies, isn't that an improper response?
Isn't it kind of reflective of the Old Testament and Jewish law?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, all 613 of them or whatever they were.
Yeah, yeah.
I've been reading the Bible every day to get through it in a year, and the the way it's laid out, it's Old Testament, New Testament, and then Psalms and Proverbs.
Mm-hmm.
And it was mentioned earlier, I am struck by the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The things that God says that he's going to do or does, the punishments, who is killed for what actions, it's just very frightening. And then you go to the New Testament that starts in Matthew with Jesus, and it's like a whole new world. So I understand, Greg, why your parishioner at one time said she didn't want to hear about the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a scary thing.
Well, I didn't help her because I said, maybe you should read the book of Revelation. That's in the New Testament. She came back really.
Very good.
And see if you understand it.
Right. But there. Let me just close one or two things, and then I don't want to lose where we are right here. Lewis says when you're faced with these cursing psalms, the obvious thing is, don't ask, don't tell, just forget about them. And he says that's not the right thing. And what Lewis suggests is we have to understand that there is such a thing as wickedness, and there is such a thing of really hurting other people. And the rawness of the psalmist is somebody who has been hurt. And so Lewis says, as you read the cursing Psalms, he said, there's no person more annoying in the world than we are. We just don't realize it. It's very easy for us to hurt other people without realizing it. And that there is evil, there is suffering, there is pain, there is injustice. And to rail against that and to be angry about that is not the final answer, but it's certainly the Jewish answer. When Pastor Kellen preached a sermon about a month ago, he ended a sermon with the example of Corrie ten Boom having to shake hands with the prison guard. I don't know if any of you were in the sanctuary. Did anyone hear this sermon?
Yes.
Very, very powerful sermon. And people stayed afterwards, and it was very, I think both Pastor Kellen and I talked to 2 or 3 people each who were really struggling with this whole idea of forgiveness. And I remember going to a Jewish rabbi in England and asking him, and he said, there is absolutely no way we would be outside our faith to forgive a Nazi monster. And when we look at some of the stuff that's going on in our culture now, there is no forgiveness. You know, forgiveness is kind of dropped off the plate in some people's discourse. If we do something wrong, there is no hope for us. Doesn't matter on the left or the right. We're good at canceling on either side. So it's really interesting, this whole idea of Christian forgiveness that helps us with the prison of self-righteousness that many people find themselves in. But if you've got very devout Jewish friends, they will love to debate you, and they'll give you a book by Simon Wiesenthal, whatever, the Nazi hunter. And there were Desmond Tutu in South Africa put together, I think, 32 different short articles about forgiveness. And this was the big debate. Is it morally okay to even forgive someone who's done something terrible? Would be sort of the Jewish position versus the Christian position. No, forgiveness has to be a factor in our faith. But the whole idea of judgment and the whole idea of cursing are 2 of the ethical issues that sometimes we feel we are probably a little more just and loving than God is, at least the Old Testament God. And we have to be careful here how much our culture does affect the way we look at things. And I think Lewis is wonderful in reminding us that the culture or the generation that follows after us will look at us in the same way that we tend to look at those who've gone before.
Greg, was the term you just used, the prison of self-righteousness?
That's right from Lewis talks about that.
What a wonderful summary, you know.
Yeah. Well, as he said, there's almost always an indignant plaintiff. It's always, as you read the Psalms, I am almost perfect. And people, I am following you, and those who are not following you are prospering. Why is this? God, defend yourself. But really, it's God, make things right with me. The last thing that he says, which I think is also very powerful, he calls it I'm trying to think of the term, the higher, the more danger. And what he means by this is that a lot of the injustice that's done has been done by religious people. And he doesn't go any further than Christianity. He talks about the Crusades. He talks about the Grand Inquisitor. And he said that when God enters a life, in fact, I want to read from this. This is so, okay. Let me just read this. The Jews sinned in this matter worse than the pagans, not because they were further from God, but because they were nearer to him. For the supernatural entering a human soul opens to new possibilities, both of good and evil. From that point, the road branches. One way to sanctity, love, humility, the other to spiritual pride, self-righteousness, persecuting zeal. There's no way back to the mere humdrum virtues and vices of the unawakened soul. If the divine call does not make us better, it will make us much worse. Of all the bad men, religious bad people are the worst. Of all created beings, the wickedest is one who originally stood in the immediate presence of God. There seems to be no way out of this. For we can still see in the worst of their maledictions how these old psalmists were, in a sense, near to God. Though hideously distorted by the human instrument, something of the divine voice can be heard in the passage. So he says, don't give up on the Psalms, even though they are the nasty bits. But he wants to get the nasty bits out of the way so he can get down to the delicious bits. And that's where he starts talking about beauty and truth and worship and joy and nature. And the majority of the Psalms that we really love would be in that category. But you're going to have to come back next week to find out about that.
Cool.
Hey, you are far more interactive than my students are on Zoom. This is a joy.
I'm glad I woke up.
So Greg, you want us to have read, some 23, 25 Psalms for our next meeting. Is that how you want to work?
Right. Now it's interesting. Lewis says there are different ways you can read the book of Psalms. He, after reading it, basically every day of his adult life, he came up with some thematic concerns. Rather, these are some different themes. So what I wanted to do is go through some themes. But as you read them, I would encourage you to, if there's one that maybe we can have a contest every week, which in the top 30, what's number one of the top of the 30 Psalms that we'll read for this next week.
Okay.
But I think what he's trying to do is provide, in the way I've got this sort of divided is these are kind of the ethical things that keep us from the Psalms. And then really to talk about the emotional richness of the Psalms. And without getting too autobiographical, it's very clear that Lewis is happier writing this book than at any other time in his life. He didn't get married till very late in life. He met this wonderful woman, then she gets cancer and almost dies, and now she's in remission. And this is when he's writing this book. And there is such joy and imagination in the way he looks at the Psalms. I think you'll enjoy it greatly. That's why I'll try to get you this article to help with that.
Okay.
But then the last section is the whole idea of how do we really interpret the Psalms? You've all heard of the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He died during the war. Bonhoeffer and other Lutherans, they see Christ in every Psalm. And Lewis is going to talk about, as a literary critic, he's going to talk about second meanings. And he actually uses the phrase, let me just read this. The triple background of the Psalms. The ancient Judaic religion which produced them, the age of Christ when they took on new meanings, in our daily experience in our present world. So it's what the theologians call exegesis and hermeneutics, but how do we find meaning in the Psalms, originally written for a Jewish audience, reappropriated by Christ? And by the way, Jesus quotes from the Psalms over and over again. And if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, you're going to find out even when he's not quoting the Psalms, he is using parallelism. So it's very, very interesting. The Psalms will maybe help you understand the teaching ministry of Jesus even a little better. And then finally, how do we appropriate them for today? And that's, but again, my modest but difficult goal is that we all read this month the book of Psalms.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
One experience that I had when the Dead Sea Scrolls were in Chicago was having some extra time actually to see the scrolls and seeing, I think it was a portion of Psalm 4 on one of the little bits of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was just amazing. In fact, I think it was the beginning of it. Answer me when I call to you, oh my righteous God.
Well, I think down through the centuries, the Psalms have just been amazingly important to Christian formation. And I feel badly that we left them out. So maybe we can get back to our old Presbyterian Psalter where that's when I was in Scotland, someone said the irony is that the Scottish housemaid knew more about the Psalms than any contemporary in our age Presbyterian pastor. And I had to say, probably true.
Wow.
Hey, God bless you. Let me pray. Father, I thank you for friends old and new. I thank you for the chance we have to kind of struggle together with some difficult issues that really affect the way we look at life. I pray that you would bless us through our reading of the Psalms and our discussion of them. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Be safe.
Andy, you're a superstar. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
It's really good.
See you next week.
See you next
Good week, everyone. See you guys Saturday.
Yeah.